Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ryan McKeel. I use they, them pronouns, and I serve as an assistant director in the Office of Identity, Equity, and Engagement. Our office is very honored and excited to welcome the Homage Exhibit back to UNC Charlotte this evening as Juneteenth approaches. The Homage Exhibit is a valued and tremendous partner of IEE and UNC Charlotte, and we are so proud to welcome them back to our campus for the first time now in this virtual space. In addition to our thanks to Nia McAdoo and Nicole Moore with the Homage Exhibit, I'd also personally like to thank my colleagues Janique Sanders and Siobhan Moore. This program has been very much a team effort in coordinating and would not be happening this evening without their support. The Office of Identity, Equity, and Engagement is honored to be joining you this evening as we recognize and honor Juneteenth. Short for June 19th, Juneteenth marks the day when federal troops arrived in Galveston, Texas in 1865 to take control of the state and ensure that all enslaved people were freed. The troops' arrival came 2.5 years after the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. Juneteenth honors the end to slavery in the United States and is considered the longest running African-American holiday, and in 2021, it officially became a federal holiday. Our guest this evening, Nicole A. Moore, is a public historian and consultant with over a decade of museum experience, primarily focused on the interpretation of enslavement at historic sites in museums and the American Civil Rights Movement. She has facilitated workshops and training sessions on best practices and pedagogy in teaching African-American history, from enslavement through the Civil Rights Movement and the impact of race and identity on visitor learning. Nicole serves on the board of directors for the Slave Dwelling Project. Her publications include chapters in Interpreting Slavery for Museum and Historic Sites, Interpreting the Civil War for Museums and Historic Sites, and Radical Roots, Public History and Tradition of Social Justice Activism. Nicole has undergraduate and graduate degrees from the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and I'm so happy to turn it over to you, Nicole.
Thank you so much, Ryan. And I am excited as a lifelong 49er to be back on campus in a virtual space, but also to be back here with Nia McAdoo doing the Homage Exhibit. And so Nia McAdoo is I don't even know what to say about you, Nia. Your family, you and your husband, have spent years collecting pieces and building this private collection, which is the Homage Exhibit, that includes artwork by artists such as Romare Bearden, Elizabeth Catlett, and you have these original documents, which I love, from Frederick Douglass, Shirley Chisholm, Booker T. Washington, and many others. You have amazing pieces of African-American history, and you have given us the opportunity to kind of peer into that collection with this exhibit. And so I am pleased to welcome you as well back to campus in this virtual space. Nia and I were both at Charlotte in various capacities at the same time. And this is a bit of a homecoming for us. And we are so pleased, and I am so pleased to enter this conversation with you tonight. So welcome.
Thank you so much. And like you said, it's great to be back virtually with UNC Charlotte. It's a place where I spent so much time. And so it's really, like you said, a homecoming. It's great to be here.
So let's dive in a little bit. Ryan gave us a little bit of breakdown about Juneteenth. As a graduate of the history program and public history program, I'm gonna give you just a smidge more about Juneteenth and kind of why this is so important for us tonight, really getting into it. And it's gonna tie into some of the pieces that Nia is going to show us, which y'all are not ready. This is fantastic. It is fantastic. But when we think about Juneteenth, we are thinking about the holiday that originated after federal troops came to Galveston, Texas, June 19th, 1865. And of course, this is 2.5 years after the Emancipation Proclamation had been signed. This is 2 months after the end of the Civil War, but it is going to be 6 months before the ratification of the 13th Amendment, which does abolish chattel slavery in the United States. One of the things that people kind of grapple with as they're learning about Juneteenth and diving into this history is they're like, well, you know, the Emancipation Proclamation freed everybody, right? Why is this a thing? And this is where I take that historian hat of mine out And I tell people, if you actually read the full Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln, he puts this out September of 1862. He gives the Confederacy 100 days to get their lives right. He's like, y'all got 100 days, count it down. In 100 days, I'm going to free those who are enslaved in states that are rebellion states. They're in rebel control. So this isn't the whole Union. And even within some of those states that are held in rebellion, he has some exclusions. So the Commonwealth of Virginia, I used to live in Princess Anne County, which is now Virginia Beach. Princess Anne County was one of those counties that was excluded from the Emancipation Proclamation. And so if you were enslaved and you were in Princess Anne County, you didn't get your freedom until really the ratification of the 13th Amendment. And so when we talk about Juneteenth, first we have to let people know it took a minute for the news to travel. And these men and women were freed when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect January 1st, 1863. But it's the enforcement of federal troops and coming into Galveston in 1865. This is what makes Juneteenth spectacular, because these men and women and children had their freedom. It just wasn't being enforced. And when you have the federal troops coming in and saying, no, for real, y'all, you're free. You can leave, you can work for wages. There's a celebration that takes place. And the first annual, or the official Juneteenth celebration is that next year, June 19th, 1866. And so Nia, for you, I know that you're not from Galveston, but you did spend a lot of time in Buffalo, which does have the honor of being one of the cities that has had some of the longest Juneteenth celebrations outside of Texas. What was that like for you growing up and knowing this holiday and really being in the depths of it?
Yeah, so I'm born and raised in Buffalo, New York. And Juneteenth was something that we prepared for most of the year. So you got to think, public school in Buffalo ends like this week. And so Juneteenth was always the official start of summer. I often talk about growing up in Buffalo at the time, and still to this day, it's a fairly segregated city, which means a lot of different things when it's broken down in day-to-day life. But what it allowed us is we lived in a community where we had community centers that were focused really on the African-American community within walking distance. So I could walk out of my door and get to 5 community centers. And so my sisters and I, we would be, at one place on the weekends, one place Monday, Wednesday, Friday, another community center, Thursday, Friday, another place where we spent summers. But we were always cued into community programming. And so with Juneteenth in Buffalo being such a large event, if you took an African dance class or a poetry class, you spent all from January to June preparing for Juneteenth, getting ready for your performances. And so it was just always something that we grew up with. Like you said, Buffalo, New York has one of the longest running Juneteenth celebrations outside of Texas. And that started in '73. So I've always celebrated and known about, the beauty and the culture of Juneteenth.
So you and your Buffalo folks are probably like, I'm sure, because the folks in Texas very said, like, y'all need to catch up. And right. Here we are, so many years later, finally acknowledged as a federal holiday. And, people are still learning about it. One of the things that I do love, though, with our chats that we do is you tie everything together, because in order to really understand and appreciate the freedoms and the moment that Juneteenth is, you got to know where you came from. You got to know what we are celebrating and why it's so important. So I know that you and your family have been doing some collecting of things to really talk about the history of African Americans in the United States. And I don't know, you feel like kicking it off and just diving into, if we begin at the beginning?
Yeah, we can definitely pull out some artifacts and just start to tell the story. The Homage Exhibit is a private collection owned by my husband and myself. And we travel the country, bringing it to college campuses, corporate partners, and to the community. So our entire collection has a little over 600 pieces, and everything is an original artifact or document. So we tell the story through original source material. One thing that we always start our shows with is a moving piece. It's a piece that when people come in, it makes them stop and look. Our earliest artifacts come from the era of slavery. And what I have here is a slave transport collar. Now, this piece is interesting for a few reasons. There are a few people who come to the exhibit and they know exactly what this is. But we always get questions, how does it sit? How is it positioned? How heavy is it? And so we recently, starting maybe in March or April, started to display this differently. So this would have been placed around the neck of someone who had either run away and was being transported to a local sheriff's office or back to a plantation, or someone who they thought would run away. So if you're enslaved and you have your family sold, you're a threat. And so this is something that would have been placed around your neck. These are bells. And so as you move, people can hear you, dogs can hear you. What we did and how we sort of shifted this picture, pardon me.
I mean, it's the sound.
Yeah. So now we display it with a form. So you have a plaster cast with African features. So when people come into the exhibit, they have a better idea of how it was used, how it would stop you, how it would look. And so that visual is something that you really can't get away from. I often tell people, I tell everyone as they enter the exhibit that we go over highs, lows, and everything in between. And we're very intentional about that. So for example, especially as we start to move into like the civil rights era, you'll see a celebration of debutantes next to a picture of John Lewis on the Pettus Bridge, because that is, life at that time.
How old is that collar?
So what we do know is that it is period, but we don't have the original sort of details on when it was made. And so that's one of the pieces that we always have right at the front that really sets the tone for the exhibit. It's really important that people sort of understand. We always get a lot of comments as people come in and they say things like, I've heard about this, but I've never seen this up close. Accessibility is very important to my husband and myself. I mentioned briefly how growing up in Buffalo, I was very involved with the local community centers. And one thing that would happen when we were younger is that the community centers would get tickets for things. So the museum, I saw Alvin Ailey for the first time through a free ticket from a community center. And so I always knew that I loved art, history, theater, dance, music. But as a young child, I felt like I could only gain access to those spaces if someone was generous enough to donate, right? Yeah. And so there were times where funding dried up and those opportunities sort of disappeared. And so as my husband and I now travel with the exhibit, it's important that community, children, college students, they have access to it. And we go all over and we're in jeans and sneakers. We're very comfortable because we want people to come in and feel comfortable. You don't have to dress up, engage with these artifacts and documents. The next item I'm going to show you, this is it's not the oldest item in the collection, but it is one of the older newspapers that we have. This is going to be a Charleston Courier from the morning of May 30th, 1804. So this is going to be 1804. Now,
you have original documents, correct? You only have originals.
Only have original documents. So we don't have any copies or duplicates in the collection. And that's intentional. That's intentional. And so with this piece, it's important to know that, slavery and the business of slavery was very much weaved into everyday life. And so in this newspaper, and understanding that Charleston was a port city. I'm reading upside down, I'm sorry. So right under my finger, hold on. Nicole, tell me if you can see.
I can see it, yes.
Okay.
A little bit of a glare, but it's okay.
Okay, can you read the title on the top one? Is it one?
That I cannot.
No,
that's because I don't have my glasses on.
I'm gonna read it. So the first ad is from J&N Bixby. It's a brokerage company, and they're selling 148 prime slaves from the windward coast of Africa. And they go into how you can pay. They expect prompt payment for full amount of your purchase. Right under that, and that auction is going to take place. I'm sorry, the next one is the sale of 367 prime Congo Negroes. And when we do the exhibit, we do use period language for the most part. So we will use the term Negro because that is how it appears in 1804 in the original document. And so it's very common to see transport services. So if you buy property in South Carolina and you need to get them to Mississippi, there's a service for that. If you need to buy suits for the enslaved people you purchase, there's a tailor specifically for that. And like I said, as people come into the exhibit, we do tell them highs, lows, everything in between. And I'm just going to keep going.
Okay.
If you have a question, please drop it in the chat, and then Nicole will weave it into our conversation.
With Charleston being a port of entry, that ad is really talking about men and women and children that are coming from the continent, right?
That is correct.
That is wild.
The next piece is actually another Charleston Courier. This is from 1834, so this is 30 years later. You can see the numbers on top of the ads. And this is an advertising manager's copy. So the numbers indicate how many times they've paid for a specific ad to run. You'll see, well, you can't see, but there's someone who's opening a dance school and they're looking for students. There's someone who's selling a home. I am going to point out
the illustration.
Yeah. So I can't reach, I'm sorry.
I do see it, yes.
Okay. You can see it here and you can see it here. And that's a runaway slave icon. And so what we have here is a $100 reward, and it's for a family that's missing. And we say missing because they identified that they don't know if they ran away or if they were kidnapped and resold out in, and probably sold to some Western dealer is how the ad reads. But we have a woman named Penny. Penny's 35 to 40. She has a teenage son named James, who's 14 or 15, and a 2-year-old daughter named Millie. Now, Millie is described as being 2 years old and being mulatto. And so what we could assume is that the person who took this ad out is also the same person who fathered that child, trying to get that property back. If Penny or her son were captured, they would have been transported in the collar. One thing that we try to do is point out, it's interesting. We have a large collection, but we are very careful on what we collect. The next one, the next 2 documents tie into Juneteenth just perfectly. My husband's an attorney and is always drawn to legal documents. Actually, let me start with this one and then I'll go to the next one. We often have questions from students or just from people in general when we travel. A lot of people think of slavery as a lot of enslaved people. They're picking a crop, be it tobacco or cotton, or and
large plantations.
Large plantations, large working plantations. And the reality is a lot of people just owned 1 to a handful. You didn't need to be wealthy to own a person.
Yeah.
This is what I'm going to show you next is an estate inventory from 1801. So when anyone passes away, they'll divvy up all of your things. They'll put a valuation to it so that your heirs know what you have here. Nicole, tell me if you see that.
I can see it in it. I mean, I know what the document says, but I can see the winch that you have.
Sure that it's visible. And so what you have is the most valuable thing owned. It's the first thing on the list is 1 Negro wench. And so it's a Black woman. She's valued at $600. So what we can assume from that is that she's past childbearing age. And more than likely, she's working in the home. She is cooking and cleaning, maybe raising children. But as a woman gets older, her value decreases. The next piece that we have will tie, both Ryan and Nicole talked about the timeline of the Emancipation Proclamation, when slaves were free, when the troops came into Galveston. This is a court case from 1867, okay? But the time that this suit addresses is 1864 to 1865, right? We know Juneteenth is 1865. This is going to be the state of Alabama. This is going to be Lawrence County. You'll see that there is a Martha McKelvey who is suing the Alexander. It's either a father or son or brothers, but the Alexanders here. So we have Martha McKelvey who is suing the Alexanders. And I'm going to read this to you. The plaintiff claims of the defendants $250 due by account for hire of Negro man Abram, the property of plaintiff, which is McKelvey. McKelvey, owns a man named Abram, and she has rented him out for hire. I'm going to read that again. for the hire of Negro man Abram, the property of plaintiff from August 1864 to July of 1865. And so when you look at the legal document, it plainly shows that a man who was technically free was still being rented out and considered property of someone else. And so when people, so very much people had to be freed by troops. It was enforced because it wasn't enforced on its own. And so you often hear stories of how planters or plantation owners would wait until the current crop was done to then free their slaves. This is interesting for another reason, is because Martha McElvery is the person bringing the suit. And you didn't see that often. One can assume that her husband died in the war. The plaintiff claims the further sum of $250 for work and labor done by plaintiffs for the defendants at their request. And so she's looking for the funds from 1864 and 1865 with interest. And so we don't know how this case turns out, but we do know that this case is brought in 1867. So there are many court cases years after the formal ending of slavery, after the amendment, that makes its way through the court system. And again, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat and we will.
Got you.
Right.
So there is one that I'm kind of answering, but would also love your take in, because when we were thinking about that document of the inventory, we have this woman who's labeled a wench. Do you know why she would have been called a wench, other than just being a derogatory term for Black women?
Pretty much it. Right. That's pretty much the answer to that. Yeah, so that is pretty much the answer to that. Was the question in the chat? Mm-hmm. Okay, yep. And then the next document we have, this is one of my favorite items, and I'll explain it a little bit. So Macon B. Allen, it's Macon, M-A-C-O-N, B. Allen, is an African-American man born in Indiana, moves to Maine, and has dreams of becoming an attorney. He finds a white attorney who does some abolitionist work, who allows him to come in as like an apprentice. So Macon B. Allen isn't able to go to law school, but he's able to work under a white attorney in Maine and sit for the bar. Macon B. Allen is the first known African-American attorney in the country. So at the top of this document, you see the state of South Carolina. Macon B. Allen gets his law license in Maine, works there and says, you know what, I don't make enough money here. There's not enough of a Black population. He moves to Boston. From Boston, he moves to South Carolina, and he is elected to 2 terms as a probate judge. So not only does the first African-American attorney in the country become an attorney, and he's able to rise to the rank of probate judge and holds that term for 2 terms. Later in life, he moves to DC. He works for the federal government doing legal work. But again, this is Macon B. Allen. You'll see his signature here and his seal and stamp there.
One of the things that does strike me about this particular document, which all of this, I learn something new every time we do this, but that's a real significance for him being the first Black attorney at the end of the Reconstruction era, where things are really starting to reel back in terms of the legal advances and really the social advances that particularly Black men were making during this time. Definitely. And for him to be the first Black attorney at the end of this era, when things pretty much go back downhill is
Right.
extremely significant.
And that's one of the reasons why he leaves South Carolina to move to DC, because again, he was in Maine. Prior to becoming probate judge in South Carolina, he was a justice of the peace in Boston. And so justice of the peace down to probate judge, and then moves back up a little further north to DC after leaving South Carolina during that time frame. And so I see I thought I saw another question in the
Brittany
chat.
was just asking for clarification of his name. I got you.
Oh, okay, gotcha. And then I see Karen has a question.
About how you started the collection and why.
So the collection started, we have artifacts and documents, but we also have art. When I purchased my first house in Charlotte, half a mile from the university where I was working at the time, my grandmother allowed me to choose as a gift, a piece of her artwork. And so I chose this Elizabeth Catlett piece called Survivor. And it was a piece that hung in her home that I loved, like absolutely loved this. And that started my art collection. The artifacts actually began when Barack Obama ran for office the first time. So we're in North Carolina, small tidbit.
Spoke on campus.
He spoke on campus in the rain. It was a beautiful scene, right where, I guess, where the football stadium is now.
Yeah.
Barack Obama came and did this wonderful speech in the rain. And there's like a picture that's everywhere from that event. But my grandmother's living in New York City, not a swing state. I'm down here in North Carolina. So we know how many times Barack, Michelle, Oprah, the whole sort of crew came to have events and speeches to support the candidate. And so my grandmother was really excited, like really excited. And so she would cut out everything, every newspaper, magazine, fundraising letter, everything. And so she would send me like priority mailbox, like boxes of stuff. And one day she asked if should I stop? Like, do you really want this? And I'm like, no, send it. And she had this serious conversation with me. And she says, in 50 years, you're going to sit down with your grandchildren and you're really going to talk about the work you did to help get them elected. And initially I sort of brushed it off and I was like, yeah, of course, and she's like, no, it's important you have these items because whoever holds that artifact gets to craft the narrative surrounding it. And she talked about the importance of that coming from Black and brown faces. So to sort of explain that or bring that idea home, a lot of the items that we collect at private auction. So we have some items from what they call ex-museum auctions. So if you go into an auction or into a museum, somebody touches something, it falls, they will then auction those things off. A lot of times families will leave all of their items to a museum and the museum is like, okay, like, what are we going to
Doesn't fit in our scope, but
right, like, we don't, but thank you. And what they'll do is auction it off. And so we go to some of those auctions as well. But this piece, the slave collar, the transport collar was actually purchased at an auction that was focused on Confederate history. The story that we tell when we put this face in that transport collar and we sit it next to an 1804 Charleston Courier with slave ads is very different than how the last owner
was telling that
the story, right? And Nana's always right. And so, now that we have this as a part of the collection, we get to craft the narrative with it. When we do shows, a lot of people, I think people get annoyed with me because they want me to take a stance on,
Yeah.
and there are some things I'm like, oh, it is what it is. But the reason why we do original artifacts, original source material, we present it to you and you have the ability to draw your own conclusion. I can explain. I do a lot of clarification. I explain a lot of timelines and people and movements, but it's not my, or at least I don't feel as a part of this collection that it's my place to state my opinion all the time. I give you an artifact, I give you an item, and as an adult, and even with our middle school and high school students, how does this make you feel? How do you interpret this? And so, some people, I'm like,
sometimes you don't need to explain the document.
Sometimes I don't, and I try not to, because I want you to draw your own opinions for it. So Karen, I hope that explains sort of how we got started and why we try to make it accessible. One thing, I'm going to keep rolling.
Keep rolling, yeah.
I showed you this earlier. These are what you call stereo view cards. This one is a picture taken of two children in Goose Creek plantation in South Carolina. It's the old Goose Creek plantation. And this one is entitled, the first one on the bottom, it's in the title of it is Picking Cotton in the South. Here at the top, you can see that it's sold by subscription only. And so we get a lot of questions about these two. We have 4 in the collection. But if you can remember when you were little, you had a
viewfinder.
Yeah. So you put the little thing and it spins and you see the picture. So prior to our little, cartoon Viewmasters, you had people who, a lot of people, if you grew up in Charlotte, North Carolina, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, more than likely you only stayed in this area. And so you could purchase a subscription of pictures that they would send you monthly, a few times a year of different things. So if you lived in a rural area and you're like, I want to know what a big city looks like, you can order the New York City collection. If you live in New York City and you want to know what rural life looks like, you'd order that subscription. But you would have a lot of people who were not familiar with Southern life and the era of slavery, and they would order these subscriptions for these pictures. And so that's what they are. You would put them in these little glasses and you would see the image in each eye. But those are stereo view cards. One of the pieces that we have that I like, it's going to be from 1886. And so we know Frederick Douglass as Frederick Douglass. There's some people in history who,
you just know.
Harriet Tubman, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth. But Frederick Douglass later in life works for the federal government in several capacities. He was a recorder, like a register of deeds in Washington, D.C. And in June of 1886, you can see his signature.
I cannot believe y'all have that. That is amazing.
And so you see his original wet signature and he's the recorder at that time. And you'll see the date of June 1886. It's important that when we do the exhibit, our intention is never to make people feel any certain way,
Yeah.
The collection goes from the era of enslavement until post-civil rights.
Mhm.
My husband and I were both born in 1978. We had to figure out a year to stop the collection. And so we said, hey, just stop it in 78. But with our first few shows, what we realized, especially when we do middle, high school, college campuses, that they were left in an era that they were sort of unfamiliar with.
Yeah.
And they felt, some people just like maybe a little bit of embarrassment or, and that's not the intention of the exhibit. We want everyone to come and see things. And so, and leave feeling empowered. I don't care if you're Black, white, Hispanic, like everyone interested in American history should be able to come to this and identify things. And so we're very intentional about putting names that people will recognize.
Yes.
Few different places. And it's funny because there are times where people will see something they know and they'll come get me to tell me they know this. And I'm like, I know this, I remember this, like I know who this is. And I'm like, that's awesome. And then we talk about some other things that they might not have been exposed to. Another piece that is a little after the time period that we're dealing with, but is one of those pieces when people see it, they're like, I know this. And this is going to be January 29th, 1907.
Yeah.
And so what you'll see here is that this is Tuskegee
Normal and Industrial Institute.
And it's a letter signed by Booker T. Washington. And a lot of people might not know his entire bio, but they know Tuskegee, they know Booker T. Washington, and they're like, I know that. It's interesting with the collection. And it's very important to understand sort of where America comes from. A lot of these things are unfortunately cyclical, like it's the same old thing, just a different era. There are a lot of letters that we have from senators, congressmen, where if you remove the date and you just read the body, you don't really know, like when. It could be today, right?
Yep.
I'm going to read this to you versus having you strain your eyes. This is going to Reverend Charles T. Russell in Weston, Massachusetts. My dear Mr. Russell, I've delayed writing you in regard to speaking at Weston for the reason that I've found myself unable so far to state a definite date for my going north. The Alabama State Legislature is in session, and whenever that is true, there are many matters that are likely to come up almost any day that concern the interests of the institution, talking about Tuskegee. I think the legislature will adjourn within a few days, and then I shall write you definitely about coming to Weston, yours very truly, Booker T. Washington. And this is one of those, it was true at the time. If Booker T. Washington announced that he was going north by train, he's going to be gone for a few weeks. It was very easy for them to call an emergency session to throw
some kind of legislation.
Right. Legislation that's going to negatively affect the work that was being done at Tuskegee. And so this is one of the items that we have that we display fairly often. But yeah, we like to put identifiers, little touch pieces that people can see and identify with. We do have current items as well. So we have items on Barack Obama's election, Kamala Harris, John Lewis later in life. So we have him, as John Lewis Civil Rights and as John Lewis later in life. We have an interesting piece that is, now people are drawn to. so we have a 1930, I don't have it today, but a 1937 Life magazine. And whenever justices would be swapped out, Life magazine would, in the magazine, put a timeline of all of the justices, the group pictures, and then the current one. And so we put this on one of the earlier tables for the 1930s time period. And then you have to go all the way to the end to celebrate where we are now. And we were able to acquire a poster that was used during her confirmation hearings. And so now that's one of the things that sort of anchors the end of the exhibit. And again, it's a touch piece where people see it, they know it, they're proud of it. And it's you end on a high note. We get a lot of questions about things that are missing from the exhibit. Like, why aren't you talking about X, Y, and Z? But it's, again, because we only tell the story through original source material. So if we can't acquire a document, we can't do it. So one of the things that we had been on our radar, but we did not have anything for, so we couldn't introduce it, was the Tulsa Race Massacre, right? There are going to be a lot of things that happen in history that there's nothing that survives Tulsa Race Massacre that we can acquire. And so we do a lot of auctions, library auctions, so that we can acquire newspapers. And so we're able to acquire a 1921 San Francisco newspaper that is talking on the front page above the fold about the Tulsa Race Massacre. And so we were able to introduce that event in the exhibit through that piece, but it wasn't until we acquired that piece that we were able to include Tulsa in the overall timeline that we have for the exhibit. Do we have any additional questions in the chat?
I think that answered a bit of Amina's question, where she was wanting to know if you seek out certain items or just come across them at auction, and if there was something that you want but you currently don't have.
So one thing, yes. So I'll put it out in the atmosphere. We have a list of things that we're looking to acquire. One section that we're trying to beef up is related to African Americans in the military. And so we have a good number of pieces, but we want to tell a more robust story about that. And so we're looking for additional items related to that. For a long time, and this is Nicole's favorite thing from the exhibit. So I always try to find a way to put it in there for her. But for a long
Listen, edges are important. Edges are important.
They are. So for a very long time, Madam C.J. Walker, I've always had a small business on the side of something, like always, ever since undergrad. My first business.
Hello, babies.
No, even before that. So I'm dating myself in the worst way. So my sophomore year of college, I took a web design course at the University of Buffalo, and I would go door to door to businesses trying to convince them to let me build them a website. Today, that sounds ridiculous, but people were like, why would I need something on the internet?
Yep.
Like, what is this? And I'm like,
I'm
telling you, like, this thing called the internet is going to be big, and you want to be on it.
It is the wave of the future, y'all.
Right? I'm trying to, stake out my claim. But the story of Madam C.J. Walker being the first millionaire, African-American woman millionaire, it was a story that I was always familiar with. And we always wanted to acquire something, and we were able to. And so what we have in our collection are 3 of her original containers, product containers. So at the top of the
control,
right. So it's Temple Fall. And on the back, you'll see it's Madam C.J. Walker's wonderful Temple Solve, and she gives directions on how to use it. What made her famous is her glossine, which is a pressing oil. So if you ever got your hair pressed,
Easter's, y'all.
Easter Sundays, you had to have that like a little bit of grease and then the hot comb came through. But this was what glossine was. This is about 100 years old, and you'll see it's Walker's Glossine, and it's made by the Madam C.J. Walker Manufacturing Company. Later, this isn't it's very well used, but this is a later version of the Glossine container, and you'll see her face at the top. Interestingly enough, this one still has product in it.
Just one time, just look.
I'm not, I will never, I will not use 80-year-old hair product. And
but that's
what you'll see is that her products were petroleum based. Madam C.J. Walker used a lot of sulfur, which you would do like dry scalp in her products, but that comes with a smell. So her items are heavily perfumed. This one, when opened, has a very faint perfumey scent. And again, this is decades later. It's interesting. So we have to acquire items before they get popular, right?
Yeah.
So we were able to acquire these, whenever, 5 years ago, but then during quarantine, Netflix releases this.
The series, the limited series, yeah.
Right. It's not historically accurate, but it is a story. And the prices for her items shot up. We would love an original green book.
Those are so hard to find.
They are extremely difficult to find. And now that there's a movie and everybody wants a green book. So there are things that we'd like to acquire. We have a list. We have some auction houses that know what we do, and they'll get some things and like, do you want it? And I'm like, yeah. And then sometimes they're like, do you want it? I'm like, not at all. So it just really depends. We're not necessarily adding to the collection anymore, but for those pieces that we're really interested in, we're acquiring certain items. So I hope that answers your questions. I know I want to be respectful of everyone's time, and it's very clear that Nicole and I can talk about this.
We can do this all day, y'all.
But
as we wrap up, do you, there is the one item that I want you to show, because I think it's your favorite, and it's starting to become one of mine. So we can really talk about kind of how far we've come, because one of the things in Granger's order is, or the general order is that, you work for wages.
Right. And Granger is going to be the general that comes to Galveston with the order, Granger's order to free the enslaved people in Texas. So people often ask, like, what's your favorite piece? And my favorite piece, it's not necessarily like the most well-known or anything like that. I'm really drawn to things that really describe day-to-day life for African Americans. This piece is from 1926, and it's the Dixie Labor Agency. And what you see here is that colored help is our specialty. At this establishment, we will recruit only colored help. By catering only to colored people, we can give our clients the most advantageous service where colored help is needed. They're hiring mill hands, drivers, porters, housemen, hotel help, car washers, like all of the people. And what they say is that this is the only establishment of its kind in St. Louis. So if you're a middle-class white family, upper-class white family, you own a hotel or a business and you want colored help, you would go here. So it's interesting. My family is from St. Matthews, South Carolina on my mother's side. But my great-grandmother left the South in the 30s to move to New York City. So my grandmother was very much raised in New York City. But when she moved to New York City, she worked as a domestic before, finding other work. And so this literally sort of shows the shoulders I stand on. When we acquired this piece at auction, we didn't initially know the date, but they also bought to auction the response letters to this. And so what we have, I want to say it's 11 responses, handwritten, beautiful penmanship of women who are applying for this job. The desperation, the explanation on why work is needed it's very humbling to read almost 100 years later. This is my favorite piece because it talks about, it just shows you sort of, especially for me, the shoulders I stand on.
Yeah.
I think we're right at 8 o'clock and I do want to be respectful of time. But I like Nicole said earlier, this has been great bringing this virtually back to UNC Charlotte. I worked on campus for a number of years. I'm very much a Niner, like die hard. And so huge thank you to Ryan, Janique, Kim, everybody in the office who really worked to get this program up and going. And so a huge thank you.
Yes.
And I see Ryan pop back in.
Yeah, I was gonna say, and we're happy to do this for what is our community, the Charlotte community. Like Nia said, we both have very strong ties. I met my husband in Charlotte, so like this is really a homecoming, and I am excited to be able to hopefully see Nia come back to campus with the exhibit. I might have to make the trip up for that one.
Definitely. And so I'm gonna hand it over to you, Ryan.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much, Nia. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, all of you, for coming. We can't thank you enough, Nia and Nicole, for bringing this virtual exhibit to the UNC Charlotte community. We've had the Homage exhibit come to campus twice before, and we'll certainly have them back in person at some point in this upcoming academic year. So on behalf of the Office of Identity, Equity, and Engagement and UNC Charlotte, thank you so much, Nia and Nicole, and the Homage exhibit for this wonderful program. And thank you all for coming. I hope everybody has a wonderful evening and a wonderful Juneteenth ahead. And thank you all so much for gathering in community and space with us. Take care.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye-bye.